that there could be other places you could be today, especially on a holiday weekend, but you chose to be in church today. And we want to thank God for that, and we want to thank you for being here. Now, in our lesson today, we studied about there is a time when it's appropriate to be silent. Now, it's interesting, the subject for our study this morning is the sin of silence. Please give your attention to Brother Josh as he shares the message.
Happy Sabbath, everybody. Happy Sabbath. Because all throughout the Bible, silence is praised, right? Silence is a virtue. Jesus used, but I also noticed as I was preparing for this study that there can be a deep, deep sin in being silent. And the word of silence in Hebrew, we're going to look into it here in a little bit, it's found all throughout the Bible. Since it's in Hebrew, it's found mainly in the Old Testament, but the word we're going to look at is mainly in a negative connotation. It's a negative connotation, and the question for us here today is there a time we should be silent, and is there a time we should not be silent? Now, our key text we read, it's from Esther 7:4. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, to be annihilated, and if we had been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have been silent. But our affliction is not to be compared with the loss of the king. So Esther said she was very much considering being silent. And I think as Christians, as Adventists living in this country, it's very easy. It's very easy for us to be silent, correct? You know, we can have these small little truths and important factors of our religion. We can have dress reform, diet reform, all these things, and they're very important. But then something happens like, let's say, the war in Ukraine. Is dress reform so important in the war in Ukraine right now? Suddenly, brothers and sisters are faced, mainly brothers in this war, with a decision. Will they remain silent and go with the flow? You know, suddenly, like, if you're vegan or not really doesn't matter, right? Suddenly, the very foundations of the reform, a religion built in war, in the world wars, the reform movement was built in the world wars. Suddenly, the basic tenets of the faith are in an ugly truth there right in front of you. Will you be silent and just kind of, maybe, or will you stand up? So I think this is a very important time for us because we live in a very comfortable world right now here in the United States. But it's not like that for everybody. Christians and Adventists all around the world have many struggles they need to deal with. And what is it like to live in another nation as an occupied person and be silent? Be hidden, be the minority among those around you. How will you live your life? So I believe we live in Babylon, right? We live in Babylon, we live in Persia, we live in Egypt, just like the people of Israel did. We are a minority that lives in the biggest, most popular, the strongest, the culturally most prominent nation of this earth. And as we live in this nation, how do we interact with the culture around us? When times are good, times are good. There was a time in Ukraine when it was good, right? Brother Alex said, when the curtain fell, suddenly there was freedom. Times were good. And the church that had grown so strong during that time, suddenly, maybe people began to fall away. Life was comfortable. But now, the land they're in is totally changed. And that, I believe, will happen to us someday as well. So since we live in Persia, since we live in modern-day Persia, or modern-day Babylon, or modern-day Egypt, we need to take an example and look at a Jewish girl. And that's why the title here on my The title slide here is Esther. She was a minority Jewess who grew up in the capital city of Persia. How did she live her life? And I want to put a disclaimer on this sermon, because as I looked into Esther, I found out that Esther was not the Jewish prize, was not the prize SDARM girl you would want. Who here would want their child to become an Esther? Raise your hand. You would. So you would want her to join the harem of a foreign king who was a pagan? Do you think the Jews were proud of this? This is a very hard heroine that they had to adopt. And there's very important reasons why they did. Esther lived a very interesting life, and it was not a Daniel and his three friends kind of life. You know, Daniel's standing up and he says, "Give me beans and rice, and I want nothing given to the gods, nothing sacrificed to the gods." Esther, on the other hand, she lived a very different life. And it's interesting, as I read about her, the Jews had a little bit of an interesting time adopting the story of Esther, because she did not really live according to the Levitical laws. She did not fit in as a good Jewish girl. You're not supposed to marry a pagan. She did all the interesting things that it's hard for that society. It would be hard for us to adopt in our own child. So what I want to say here is the life of Esther, the lives we see in the Bible, they are not always the perfect life, right? Sometimes they had struggles, and we're going to see that Esther had some real struggles. But you know what? There was a time when she needed to stand up, and she stood up. Just like there was a time when Daniel and his three friends, they stood up as well, in a very different way. So I think we should look deeper into this. Now, as we go along here, we're going to learn about King Ahasuerus, and I don't know, sometimes we have people of varying Bible or biblical backgrounds, so I tried to just verbally write out the story of Esther, and I don't really have slides today, I just have so no one's going to be reading, they're just going to be staring at me. But the story of Esther is in Esther 1, and it is a story commemorating a Jewish holiday called Purim, P-U-R-I-M. And in this story, there's King Ahasuerus, and we would know him. Biblical scholars think that he is King Xerxes, the same king who was fighting the Greeks, fighting the Spartans and the Athenians. This is King Xerxes, and the context is around 450 BC, so 480, BC, 480 years before the birth of Christ, approximately. And King Ahasuerus, in the beginning of Esther, he has had a huge rebellion in Egypt and Babylon, and he has put that rebellion down. And if you read in Esther, and I encourage you all to read, he has a kingdom that goes from Ethiopia all the way to India. Huge kingdom. And what he does is he invites all of the dignitaries from all of the provinces that he is ruling over, and he brings them to his capital city in Susa, and he says, "I need to be glorified. I have reestablished my kingdom." And he puts on a huge 7-day feast. And this is an important thing, because he wants to show the provinces all around how powerful he is. So Susa is on display. It's kind of like when Putin parades the army, or the Chinese parade everything, and we do too. We have Military Day. He's showing the world that he has conquered, that he is the number one. So this is very important for him to reestablish his dominance in his kingdom. He has a 7-day feast, and there's much drinking and wine. And near the end of the 7-day feast, what does King Xerxes or Ahasuerus do? This sets the stage for the kind of man this king was. I don't know about you, but I don't want my daughter to marry this man. He wants his queen Vashti to come because she's part of his persona, and he wants her to parade around. It says in Esther 1:11, parade around in her crown. Now, when I looked into this, there's more than just parading around in her crown. Actually, there's less. he didn't want her to parade in anything else but her crown. Pretty much crown only. And Vashti, she is the queen, she has standards. And she says, no, I'm not going to parade for you. And what's very interesting is this refusal suddenly puts a huge stain on the name of the king, because he's been showing the world how great he is. He's conquered everything. And now this woman has just shut him down. Just like that. How can the wife of the king, his advisors say, how can the wife of the king shut down the most powerful man in the world just like that and reject him? This is a very bad precedent for your kingdom, a very bad precedent for all of us. Now all of us dignitaries will be shut down by our wives. So naturally they all admit, you know what, Vashti, she didn't want to parade around in only her birthday suit and crown. We will get rid of her. And that's what the king does. And into this comes a little Jewish girl. And in Esther 2 verses 10, it says here that Esther had not made known her people or kindred, for Mordecai had commanded her not to make it known. So you know the way Esther was living? Just like everybody else around her. Like all the Persians, she looked no different. She ate no different. No one could identify her as a Jew. Is this the kind of fairy tale you want your child to be raised into? And Esther, she gets swept up in the search by the king for a new queen. And do you think they picked the nice, most saintly dressed ladies around? I don't know. However it is, Esther is swept up and she is taken to the harem. And she remains a Jewess in disguise. You contrast this with Daniel. We love Daniel and his 3 friends. Right away, they identify who they are. They are known as royalty of the Jews. And they say, you know what, we won't live your lifestyle. We are going to live the lifestyle of Christ. I see no evidence of this in the story of Esther. Is it right? I think I will not judge her. I will not judge her, but she lived a very different life compared to the heroes of the Bible we study about. And as time goes on, while she is there, they feel about a year she waited in the harem of the king. She fit in, she blended in, she dressed like everybody else, and eventually she did that so well that she was selected among all the people that the servants of the king had harvested. She was selected to be the new queen. And if you turn to Esther 2:15, it says that Esther was winning the eyes, winning the favor of all the people who interacted with her. All the leaders, the governors, the rulers, she won all their favor. Not just the favor of the king. She fit in. She was as good at the game of politics as anybody else. Now, into the story comes another story where Esther, who apparently is secretly keeping a close relationship with Mordecai, they discover that there is something happening in the background, and there were people plotting for King Xerxes' life. And they intervene on that, and that goes into the rest of the story of Esther. But into that story comes somebody else, an evil person. His name is Haman, and he is called an Agagite. Does anyone remember Agag? You know, it's very interesting because Agag is an example of when you disobey God. This is an aside. This is a rabbit trail. I recommend everybody read 1 Samuel 15 this afternoon. And you'll see what happens when God says to do something and King Saul does not do it. It results in almost the complete annihilation of the people of God in Persia centuries later. How one thing God can ask us to do, and we fail to follow his command. And now you have an Agagite down the lineage years later, and he is plotting the destruction of God's people. And One of the key things that bothers Haman, the Agagite, is that Mordecai the Jew refuses to bow down. So Mordecai, he is a true good Jew. He refuses to bow down to other people, refuses to bow down to other gods. And this leads Haman down a road of plotting to take the lives of all the Hebrew people. Let's turn in your Bibles to Esther verses 3, verses 7, because this is key to why the Jews celebrate this holiday, the holiday of Purim. It says, in the first month, which was the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, they cast pur before Haman day after day. And pur means casting lots. They cast pur before Haman day after day and cast it month after month until the 12th month of the month of Adar. And what was Haman looking? He was having his servants cast lots for him because he was trying to see in his head, he thought if the gods of Persia agreed with his plan, the lots would come out the way it should, and then his plan was guaranteed to work. So Haman cast lots, or pur, and finally they came in his favor, and he went before the king, and he goes before Xerxes, and he says, there are people in this land. There are people, they don't obey the laws you obey, they don't, or you have made. They don't eat the way you eat. They don't dress the way we all dress. And in the end, since they follow their own laws, they are undermining everything you seek to do in your kingdom. And then on top of that, Haman says, you know what? I'm going to also give you some money to help exterminate these people, these Jews. And it's interesting because as they look at Haman, they believe that Haman himself was vying for the throne years later. He was positioning himself in a position so where maybe someday he could overtake Xerxes. So Haman was the second most powerful man in the land, and he fabricated this plan, and suddenly the Jewish people, a minority, have everything against them. The governors, the police, the military, and in this new edict made by the king, anyone who kills a Jew can take all their clothes, their food, their cars, their lands. It's all theirs. You can just take whatever you want on a specific day. There will be a genocide. And all the belongings of the Jews in the whole empire from Ethiopia to India will be all the Jews will be fully eradicated. And this is where I want to slow down. I wanted to give the context of the story of Esther. I want to slow down here in Esther verses 4. Esther, I don't know what she's doing, but maybe a year has gone by. She is unaware of the laws that have been passed. She's living in the palace, a life of luxury, probably sitting in her hot bath. And then somebody tells Esther, Mordecai is crying and weeping in the gate in sackcloth and ashes. So Esther sends one of her eunuchs in Esther 4 verses 5. She calls Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs, who had been appointed to attend her, and ordered him to go to Mordecai and learn what this was and why it was. She has no idea. She has no idea what has happened to her people. No idea of the laws being passed. No clue. Brothers and sisters, are we like Esther? Are there Esthers in this congregation who have spent their lives blending in, right? And you know what? When it's easy to blend in, it's easy. You can just fit right in. There's no differentiation. And here she fit in so well, she became the queen of Persia. But suddenly Mordecai sends something back to her. Esther 4 verses 8. Mordecai also gave him a copy of the written decree, saying, here's proof, right? This is the decree by your husband, the king. And he showed it to Esther and explained it to her and commanded her to go to the king and beg his favor and plead on the behalf of her people. You know, and I've read this so many times, and I find Esther willing. She's going to go out there and she's going to stop this. But you know what? When you read this closely, how does Esther respond? She says, look, I'm not allowed to go to the king. I'm supposed to sit here and be pretty in my hot bath and get my nails taken care of and my hair brushed and my jewelry. I'm not supposed to go to the king. If I go to the king, he could kill me. That is how Esther responds to Mordecai. If I go to the king, he could kill me. She's giving excuses. She's saying no. It's not direct, but she's saying no. All along she's blended in, and Mordecai says, now is time for you to stand up. And Esther, in a longer way, says, no. I'm not going to go. I'm not going to stand up. And I've never really seen that part of Esther, because we always focus on the heroic side of her. But you know what? She was a human just like you and me. She was a human just like our brothers in Ukraine now. What will she do? Where will she go? And the story goes on. Esther 4 verses 13. These are the famous verses we all like to look at. And I think there is a point here that I want to focus on more than everywhere else in the sermon. Esther 4 verses 13. Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do you think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews? For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise from the Jews from some other place. But you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this? You see, she's safe. She's the queen. She's so dissociated, maybe she doesn't even feel like she belongs. But you know what? Do you think you can really get away with this? Now, it's interesting because Esther doesn't have the name of God anywhere in there. The whole book of Esther, you look for it, I challenge you, you will not find the name of God. But these two verses here point to divine providence. While Mordecai does not say, God will protect the Jews, he pretty much says, Esther, you either stand now and intervene, or God will make a way and you will be lost. God will make a way, but you and your father's house, they will perish. And who knows, is this the time that you were put in this position, in this place, to make this intervention? So Mordecai knows that Esther is resisting, and he is saying that if you don't act now, salvation will come from some other place. Now, I would like to pull in another person now before we go into the rest of Esther. Or not the rest, but the rest of the story here in the last few minutes. There were ugly times in this nation, in the history of this world, where one could intervene, right? And we know, those of us who are reformers, we know where we came from. Because there was a time when the large church, the SDA church, was all around the world, and different nation bodies stood up and said, you know what? We're the right ones. We're the Aryan race. We're the Americans. And the world went to war with each other, and people in the churches got caught up in something bigger than themselves. And Martin Niemöller, he was actually a Lutheran pastor in Germany in 1894 to 1984. He sympathized with the cause of the Nazis, and he supported the radical right-wing political movements. He really thought that Adolf Hitler was bringing something good to Germany. In fact, many early Adventists in Germany felt, you know what? Adolf Hitler is bringing something good. He's focusing on the family. There's talk he might be a vegetarian. There's all this stuff. And when this movement comes to a head in 1933, Martin Niemöller, he's on top of this. He says, I agree. And I'm sure he preached sermons in his church. I agree. And then Catholics and Adventists, and there were people, they got pulled into this national movement and they went with the flow and they agreed. But then after Hitler takes power, he starts to see where the Nazi movement was going. And he became an outspoken critic of Hitler's interference in the Protestant church. Martin spent the last 8 years of Nazi rule from 1937 to 1945 in Nazi prisons and concentration camps. And he is remembered for this post-war statement, and I'm sure many of you have heard it. First they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out, because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I didn't speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. So there is a time, there are places in our lives where we are put, and it may seem just right. But the question is, when we hit the wrong patch of land, when we hit the wrong time in a nation's history, are we gonna speak out? Will we speak out when we need to speak out? If we keep silent, salvation will come from some other means. And there will be no one left to speak out for you. So I felt this Lutheran pastor, he was put very much in a similar way as Esther, maybe less power. But so often we can get caught up in the cultural and national and political things of our nation and end up totally lost. Totally lost because we kept silent at the wrong time. Verse 14. Esther 4:14. If you keep silent. If you look that up in every Bible translation, it says, if you keep silent. The Hebrew word for silent is lekaresh. Lehekaresh. And it means to make oneself as if they are deaf. Something happens, something said, and you pretend you didn't hear it, see no evil, hear no evil, do no evil, right? Something happens and it's like, I didn't see that, and you just ignore it. To be as one deaf. Now what's interesting about Esther 4:14, if you keep silent, if you look in the Hebrew, and I looked at various interlinears, it says, if you keep silent, yes, silent. So it says lekaresh, takarishi, which means lekaresh, silent, yes, silent, together. This is the only place, or one of the only places in the Hebrew Bible this is ever mentioned. Mordecai, though, is referencing another phrase elsewhere in the Bible by saying this, because it is nowhere else in the Bible. If you keep silent, yes, silent, is found in one other place. And it's found in an obscure chapter of Numbers, verses 30. And I'm sure no one has ever read Numbers verses 30 because I never did. Before I found this out. I probably did, but it didn't mean anything to me. And Numbers verses 30 is very interesting. I recommend you all go there. It's a story. These are part of the laws of a woman in a father's house. If a woman makes a foolish vow and her dad hears about it, and he is silent, yes, silent, when he hears of the foolish vow, and then later on, a month goes by, he says, why did you do this foolish vow? It's too late. The time has gone by. And he bears her sin. And then it goes to Numbers 30, verses 3 through 14. If a husband has a wife who makes a foolish vow, a foolish promise, does something foolish, and the husband hears of it, but he is lekaresh, tekaresh, he pretends it never happened. It's like he's deaf to it. Oh, she said this, I disagree, but I'm going to pretend it never happened. And then time goes by and he realizes what she did was wrong. I don't agree with this. And he comes back to her and he says, this was wrong. It's too late. he was silent at the wrong time. And because he was silent at the wrong time, he bears her sin. This is the only place this phrase is in the Old Testament. So Mordecai is referencing Numbers 30, and it's interesting, there's a double meaning behind it, because in the ancient Hebrew, the way they spelled husband really was very similar to the way they spelled woman. So if you read Hebrews 30 verses 13 through 15, it could say, if a woman, here, where is this? I should find it because I'm going too far off. Let's see, here's how it would sound. If any vow or restrictive oath that would cause excruciating hardship, the woman can affirm or the woman can annul. But if she is silent, yes, silent, from day to day, then she will have affirmed all the vows or the restrictions. She will have affirmed them, for she was silent on the day that she heard it. She acted as if she was deaf. And if she tries to annul it, after she has first heard it, she bears his sin. So in a way, Mordecai is getting a double meaning out of this verse. Why is this significant? First of all, this is about a father with his daughter. This is about a husband with his wife. Why is this significant? Because we all have responsibility for our spouses. We all have responsibility for our children. And if at some period in time we see our children doing something and we act as if we are deaf and we don't intervene, we bear their sin. If we have something in our marriage, maybe a husband does or a wife does, and the spouse holds their silence and does not speak out at the right time, they bear the responsibility. And what Mordecai is telling Esther here today, that if you remain silent, less silent, silent, yes, silent, you are being an accomplice in the crime of your husband. You are being an accomplice in the genocide of your people if you remain silent. When the Jews looked at this Hebrew 30 section, or Numbers 30 section, they actually said that a father or a husband had 24 hours or a full day to intervene on something. If they ignored that for a full day, they bared the responsibility. I find this interesting in how we run our families. I find this interesting on how we interact with our spouses, because this is a husband to a wife, but Mordecai flipped it on end and said, no, it's also a wife to your king, the pagan husband. Brothers and sisters, there is a time for us to stand up. And if we think that it's safe to be silent, if we think we can play neutral, if we think we can ride the middle of the fence, have one foot on each side, we are an accomplice to the crime. Esther, by resisting, was being an accomplice to Xerxes to destroy her own people because she would not open her mouth. That is what Mordecai was telling her. So dare we be in Esther, maybe floating along with society, but then we realize there is something that is happening that we can no longer remain silent. So I say, who would want their child to be an Esther? Probably the first half of her life, we don't really aspire much to. We don't promote, right? We like our Daniels. But the thing about Esther is she stood up when she needed to stand up. And she revealed herself when she needed to reveal herself. And God has a plan for every one of us. We are here for a purpose. Esther 4:14, and who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this. Everything that she took to get to this point was for this very decision. Would she remain silent and promote the sin of her husband, her wayward husband? Or would she annul it? Would she annul the sin of her husband? If you look at the language of Numbers 30, it's to affirm or annul. It's to affirm or annul. It's to say, yes, I agree, or no, I annul, or I reverse the promise my spouse has made. We cannot be neutral. We are either affirming. Our poor brethren and sisters in Ukraine are either affirming or they are annulling. There is no middle ground. And you know what? For me here in America, it's an easy thing to preach. I look up some stuff, I research it, I put it together. It's an easy truth. It's an easy truth when you don't have to actually live the truth, right? But there will come a time in our lives here where we float through society so smoothly, we will have to make the decision. Will I confirm what society does? Will I confirm it? Or will I annul it? Will I reverse it? I believe firmly that everybody here has doors that have been opened and closed because of where they're at. Some are here as immigrants. Some have been here in different fashions. Some of us, the children, who knows where they will go? Who knows what they will be? They could be rich, they could be wealthy, they could be influential. But there will come a time when where they are, they will need to act either for God or for the devil. There will be no middle ground. Historical Sketches from Ellen White, page 285. There is an earnest work to be done in this age, and parents should educate their children to share in it. The words of Mordecai to Esther apply to the youth today. Who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? The youth should be gaining solidity of character, so that they may be fitted for usefulness. So remember the wordplay of Numbers. The husband can affirm or the husband can annul. Or it's very similar to a woman can affirm and a woman can annul. You know what the other meaning of Purim means? So in the Akkadian and the Persian it means to cast lots. That's what Haman did. He cast lots for the destruction of the Jews. But in Hebrew it means to annul, to reverse. So the very name of their holiday is how Esther stood up and reversed the order of her husband, because she was responsible and liable to carry his sin. Brothers and sisters, I believe we have many Esthers. I believe we have many Daniels among us. I think of Esther as maybe someone who has been wayward for a period of time. Maybe they fit in and maybe they weren't obvious. You know, they walked the line, they still showed up in church, but then during the week we look like the rest of the world, everything's fine. But it's important in our heart that as we may be flying under the radar, we realize there comes a time when we're going to have to stand up for what God wants us to do. Esther, who may not have been an obvious Jewish hero, still was a hero for God. Correct? And we must not remain deaf to all those things around us. Just like the church of God all around is interacting with going to war, with doing all these different things, there comes a time when we have to realize that, you know what, we cannot be silent. There is a sin in silence. So my wish and prayer for all of us today as we close is that we look at our lives, we search our lives, and we decide, where are we? Am I a Daniel? Am I an Esther? How have I been living my life? What would I do if I were in Ukraine right now? What would I do if I were in Africa somewhere right now? You know? Esther, she may have eaten everything. They even speculate, well, was she even eating the clean foods? She probably fit in just with the Persians. But there came a time when she decided, you know what, I'm going to stand up for the people of God. And my wish and prayer for each and every one of us today, that when we come to that point where it feels so good to be neutral, where it feels so good to be silent, that we stand up and we annul and we say, no, I am not going to be silent. I am going to follow the Lord. That is my wish and prayer for all of us. May He help us accomplish this. Amen.
Thank you so much for this thought-provoking subject and statement. And may we